the interview done with Marlon Brando by Dick Cavett after he won the Academy Award for The Godfather and sent the Native American lady in his place.
Yeah.
And it was a full 45-minute interview, and it was amazing because what happened is they would talk, one would talk, one would listen. One would talk and one would listen. And there was like pauses for reflection, and it was just very different from most of the conversations that we see nowadays, where people already have, we're not trying to learn, where people are just talking over top of each other, trying to make a point.
Of course.
Just share that with me. Just talk to me a little bit about that. And I'm not recording anything yet, so, well, I am kind of, but talk to me a little bit about that.
Because the sports format is getting so popular. You know, two guys according prior to have different points of view.
Right.
So they do this. So CNN start doing it the same with politics.
Oh, really?
And fucking shit. Yeah, that's CNN has the blame of that. And then Fox News and whatever. But CNN start that kind of interaction when someone needs to have one point of view and the other one has the opposite.
Right.
But they do it on purpose so that people can easily understand a conversation, black or white.
So what you're saying is it's on purpose to make the conversation more difficult to understand?
No, it's easier to understand if two people disagree.
Right.
Because you can agree with one and you don't need to listen even the ones you agree.
Right. But that's what's missing. Other than Panthro. Panthro's not missing from anything. But
Mtro is going to be like this.
He's so great. You're the best dog in the whole wide world. I feel like that's what's missing.
Yeah. Totally.
Like, so you and I, when we talk, we don't always agree on everything, right? I mean, that's not how it works. We don't have to, but we agree on a lot of things. We agree on the destination. We don't agree on the path.
Of course.
And, but sometimes you listen to me and we go on the path that I say to go on, and sometimes we listen to you and we go on the path that you say to go on. But that means listening, obviously respecting each other and listening to and trusting that we're going in the same direction. I feel like all the things that I'm seeing now are people putting people in front of each other who are not interested in going in the same direction at all.
Well, in television, yes.
Yes.
In internet, of course, it's happening. But I think in real life, people talk all the time and get to agreements.
What? Are you saying that the internet's different than real life?
Well, maybe. I don't know. I will need to do some research.
That's
to live 30 years of my life prior the invention of the internet.
That's not what Black Mirror has taught me. I've been watching a lot of Black Mirror, and
clear that point.
Black Mirror has a whole other viewpoint about that. I just wanted to chat about that because it just really bothers me. It really, really bothers me.
Yeah.
What?
It's because the format, because people quit to read, and reading is more complicated. And television and internet wants videos of 5 minutes, so it's easier to have a click if you're seeing two people arguing each other. So it's not like people are arguing all the time. It's just like it's very spectacle, and people like that, and they have more likes, and that's the problem. That people start to behaving like you were in internet.
Yeah.
Internet is a show. It's like a circus.
Right, and then that spills over into regular behavior, where maybe they start killing each other, they start shooting somebody, or they start domestic violence.
Problem. That's the problem if you don't have, if you confuse an argument like this thing with the Me Too movement.
Okay, let's talk about the Me Too movement in this context, because I think that's very valuable.
Yeah, I think it's very important to understand that it's very the Me Too movement is about sexual behavior, sexual harassment, and many systematic problems that exist in everybody everywhere in the world. And what we're seeing right now is called backlash. The backlash is where privileged people see threatened by these kind of movements,
Right.
and trying to diminish the movement, saying things that they are not related to the topic, like saying like, oh, what's the name of this comedic that's being exposed?
Aziz Ansari.
Aziz Ansari. We're saying like, oh, but that's not rape, but he's not being accused of rape.
Right.
This is not a criminal investigation.
Right.
This is not everything is about the penal system and the justice system.
I really want to just address that, because you really have we've talked about this a little bit, but you didn't barely even watch, because you don't respect me as a human being.
I don't.
I mean, I don't want to frame it well.
It's like,
You respect what I could be, but you don't respect me as I am. No, so the Me Too movement. I got asked this in our discussion that we had the other week, last week at this time. We were at the library, and you were gracious enough to be a guest lecturer for our discussion about false allegations. And the issue that came up was eventually at the end during the questions, people asked about the Me Too movement and what I thought about it. And what I said is, well, there's two separate issues. The first issue is people needing a safe space to talk about what's happened in their life and the experiences that they've had, right? And talk about things that have hurt them, or things where they felt where they didn't have agency, or they couldn't make good choices, they couldn't make safe choices. Then there's a whole continuum of things in that realm where there needs to be talking, and there needs to be a discussion. And then the other part of that is, if somebody makes a criminal allegation, that's when protocols come into effect, when there's a need for the justice system to respond. And the justice system does not need to respond until there is a criminal allegation. However, there is this gray area in between, right? And that gray area is where you have someone who makes an allegation of an actual crime to a third party, or to a law enforcement, to a mandated reporter, and then that gets to police, and they can initiate an investigation or not. So there is this gray area in between. And like I think what you just said is so important, and that is that not everything requires a penal response. There has to be a place where people can talk without the fear of civil or criminal litigation, so that we can get along, right?
Yeah. And also, it's like, but there is a tricky perception, because it's not, they're doing it on purpose. The backlash is about to say like, well, that's not great. Well, there's a lot of things that happens in a lot of people's lives that they are not crimes,
right?
And they are great, and that things affects a lot those persons, and they want to talk about that. So
right.
If you are trying to compare anything that happens to someone to an act, to a different type of behavior, as a crime, as a rape,
right,
to diminish the impact of that type of behavior.
Right.
It's
That
not innocent.
well,
It's not the idea of doing these claims. These claims is about to say, oh, these women are talking too much. Now this is a witch hunt.
right.
It's not.
Well, and but that means there has to be a responsibility on both sides, right? On the side of one side, to make clear what it is they're trying to accomplish, rather as opposed to actually going on the witch hunt. What?
What's the other side?
What's the other side? To listen and to not judge. What?
What's the other side?
The other side is if you're making a statement and you're trying to talk about the things that have harmed you, the other side is if they're doing it in a way that's responsible and it's honest and it's talking about their emotions and their experience, then the other side, the side of the equation that's being accused, or that's in the group that's being discussed, they have an obligation to listen. They have an obligation to allow that conversation to take place without attacking it or the people in it, if that conversation is reasonable and responsible. The problem is, on both sides, it becomes unreasonable very quickly. That's what I see on both sides.
I don't think so.
You don't. Oh, this is where we disagree. I love it. Tell me where I'm missing the boat, because it happens to me a lot.
I think there's no two sides. There's no two sides. I mean, it's like there's one. Let's say that there's one side called Me Too movement.
Okay.
There's a bunch of people talking to each other, trying to do things. There's not have a clear leadership. This is a social movement.
Right. That's right.
But on the other side, there is no other side. We are all living in this. The other side could be Kevin Spacey.
Right.
That's the other side. The other one, the guys who are being accused
Right.
or exposed to do those kind of things.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay.
Don't know the other side because we don't even have a participation in this thing.
Right.
In terms of, we don't regulate what need to do or what they need to say or not say because we are not part of that conversation. You and me are not part.
There we go.
If someone tweets or book into the conversation, maybe that.
Well, that's a great segue. And here's the way that you and I get involved in something like this is if someone makes a formal allegation of a crime, and then you will be called to evaluate, and you will be called to evaluate the victim, and I will be called to evaluate the physical evidence of the crime scene and the behavioral evidence. So that's the way that we get involved. If it's just a social issue of having a discussion or being a social movement, there is no need to participate. And that's what I meant by listen. The side is that our job is to listen. Our job is to hear, and not lash out or take a position about their credibility, because it's not really about that.
I think our job, and this is a working process because I don't have that clear. I think our job is to, yes, listen, but also to trying to point because there's a lot of people using the justice system trying to put this into the conversation.
Right.
And I think the most dangerous part is when they say, oh, well, now everything is going to be rape.
Right.
Now, no. Nobody's saying that. No, I don't hear anyone saying that rape is the same as a sexual harassment or whatever.
Right.
They're doing this. You can. There's a fake news running. I think the last week they're saying that now feminists are saying that if you masturbate thinking in someone.
Right. I saw that. Yeah, I saw that. It's lunacy.
Fake news. That's not a real thing.
Right.
Someone do that joke. They bad joke, and they do it. They put it like it was a real woman saying that. Yeah. And everybody shared that because they want to believe that. They want to believe these movements like Black Lives Matter. Right. They're seeing too loud and they're saying too many things.
Well, let's talk about that for just a second. I had that experience the other day. I had a person come up to me, and we were both in the same space, and there was a public television on, and the person came up to me. They were an older white gentleman, and they asked me, and they look at me and they think, oh, well, you're a white person, so you must agree with everything that I think. So they said, what do you think of this Black Lives Matter stuff? I mean, that's just nonsense. They're up there and they're taking a knee during the national anthem. I mean, that's just disgraceful. And the news just happened to be running a little segment on it, a little discussion about it. He goes, it's just disgraceful, disrespecting the flag like that. And he said, what do you think? And he directly asked me what I thought, and I believe he thought I was going to sympathize with him and be like, regular bar talk. Oh yeah, that's terrible. No, of course I don't think that. My response immediately was, well, I live in the United States of America, and anytime I see somebody making a protest that's peaceful and they're saying what they think and they really believe it, and it has some sort of redeeming virtue to it, I have no say. It makes me just really pleased that I'm an American and that I live in the United States where we can peaceably have demonstrations like that. And I think if that's what they need to do, then I have nothing to say about it. It's absolutely a great exercise of, their First Amendment rights. And he was like, well, that's not the same thing as, they're talking about the flag. I'm like, no, they're not. They're not protesting the flag. They're protesting, the police shootings of black men. They're protesting civil rights. They're protesting the long history of mistreatment. They're protesting a whole number of racial things that actually celebrate the flag, that actually celebrate what the U.S. Constitution's about. And he goes, well, I've never heard that. I never heard that before. Is that really? And I'm like, well, I guess it depends on what kind of news you're watching. Because if you watch one type of news, you'll get one message. And if you watch another type of news, you'll get another. He goes, well, I still don't understand. I just don't like the protests. And I said, well, what do you think about Rosa Parks? Oh, and this, by the way, this happened on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So, because he was already a little bit, and this guy is in his 70s, so he's representative of a very specific demographic. But he asked me, so I said, so what do you think of Rosa Parks? He goes, well, who's Rosa Parks? And I said, well, Rosa Parks is the lady who wouldn't be put into the black section of the bus. She wouldn't sit in the back of the bus when they had the buses divided up. He goes, well, that kind of stuff doesn't go on anymore. That's not really relevant to the conversation. And I said, look, my friend, I testify in Mississippi. I work in Arkansas and have testified there, and I work in Georgia. I've worked in Alabama, and I can assure you that there are still those problems that exist, even in the courthouses where people are trying to get justice. Even today, right now, that kind of problem exists. That marginalization. It's not as overt, but it's very much there. And he's like, oh, really? Well, and it was just like, not only had he not thought of any of that stuff, but it did not fit the narrative of the news that he was getting and the regular diet of news that he was feeding himself in order to reaffirm those positions. Talk to me a little bit about that, because that, to me, we have the Me Too issue and the Black Lives Matter issue. They're not exactly the same, but they're joined in that you have people making peaceful protests about being marginalized, whether it be by a race or gender, and you have another segment who's seeing it and trying to make it into something it's not, so they don't have to be responsible or to marginalize it, to put it down. Talk to me about that a little bit, because that's I see them as I see the response as related. Thoughts on that? On the
it's there's this psychology from Argentina. I don't remember her name right now, but she's a very she explained very well the concept of backlash. The backlash is what we're seeing with Me Too and any movement. And if you're today, I will trivialize this a lot, but I will.
That's okay.
There's this new movie about Star Wars, and obviously everybody's gonna love Star Wars, and they're gonna say, "I love Star Wars," and I will put Star Wars. And obviously, because we want to preserve our identity,
right?
We say like, no, it's not that good movie.
Right.
It's not that great. It's just a movie. Of course, it's just a movie, and we can like it or not like it. But the opinions tend to be different. But the backlash means like there's a social movement always when the wave comes to this one.
Yep.
It's a bigger way to this forward.
Right.
In order to, like you say, to have the system in the same way.
Right.
You're pushing back, and the system push you back harder.
Yes.
Then it's like there's movement.
Right.
So that's in sociology, that's the sociological aspect, of this thing. But obviously needs to be up with the things how we consume media.
Right.
Because the ones, the headline,
That's right.
Movement is because this French Association of Women say that the Me Too movement is very, they have problems, and that's very good news because that puts voice to a lot of people who wants to say, well, maybe it's not that much, and blah, blah, blah. So we have a problem to understand our world in terms of what you describe as a diet of news.
Yeah.
I think that's a very big problem.
Well, how you feed yourself, where you go, and how you break down your news. There are people who actually believe that, oh, well, this is absolutely truth. When I get it from this source, because I like this person, or because I like what they say, or because I perceive news as being immutable, it's absolutely, I don't have to check. Absolutely sure. And where you think you're absolutely safe, and where there's science behind it, the messenger and the way the message is packaged and how it's filtered changes it. And we have an obligation to not just accept what we're told and go only to those sources that make us feel good about ourselves, or that make us feel that preserve our sense of self, that preserve our identity.
That's why it's very important the diversity in
right.
every
I like that.
public scenario. Congress,
Oh, yeah.
televisions, I mean, everywhere, because we have the need to hear different voices. But when I'm saying different voices,
Yeah.
this is very important. There's going to be people in power who are going to say, oh, we're going to participate. We need more men talking about Me Too. We need no, we don't need that.
No.
People who actually we don't hear before, not the old ones who want to participate in this new conversation.
Right.
That's, I think, it's going to be difficult in terms of to secure that, because that's the real that can lead to real change.
Well, here's a funny part, and this is related to what's going on right now in Sitka. Right now in Sitka, there are groups in town debating the future of our salmon and herring fisheries, and they have a public forum. People come from all over the coast, all up and down the United States, the western coast, not just Alaska, but California, Washington, Oregon, come here to testify in Sitka, because this is where the meeting is at, to help this group of people make decisions about what they're going to advise to be done with the fisheries, whether or not it's going to stay the same, whether or not they're going to put more limits on the fishing, whether or not they're going to suspend it, when they're going to suspend it. All these decisions are based on, one, scientific data that exists in various forms, some good, some bad, and two, public testimony about the need for the fishery and what it means. All these things will be factored in. And there are multiple sides, including the native side, which is we are fishing their resource to depletion. That's their side, and it should be preserved for natives because, it's theirs. This is something that we came in and we are harvesting at rates that some say are too high and that some say are just fine, and the testimony's all over the place. But what it comes down to is we have an obligation. What was interesting about this conversation is it took place, and all day long it took place. Then a good friend of mine named Tommy G, who's a native, he spoke. The native community got together, and they held their own meeting, and they invited the people who were holding the other meeting to come sit and listen to them talk about it. So instead of it being a place where they went and there was hundreds of people, like there were one day it was like 300 people signed up to testify just in the public forum about it. I mean, it was huge. So one day it's them testifying for this group of people who are essentially, represent the interests, a more national, homogenized interest, which has a very pale face to it. and then there is the other side, which is the native side, and they wanted to have their own forum in their own space, and they did. And the other side came, and I thought that was pretty good. I thought that was really reasonable. And I don't know what came of it, but what I noticed is you can have these reasonable conversations. I don't know that they lead to better policy, but one of the things they did, which I thought was really interesting, is at the beginning of the meeting, they played a tape from 1997 of testimony about the same thing, and the same concerns were voiced, the same exact concerns. So there was nothing new was being discussed. Everybody's saying the same thing. The fishermen say, leave it alone, let us keep fishing. The scientists say we need to be good stewards and conserve, and the natives say it's going away. This is dying. You're killing it. Stop. Yeah. So it was very interesting. I don't have a stake in the fight other than this is my hometown and it brings money in. So, that's the problem. The problem is the problem has always been a lack of diversity. I'm really pleased to see that the native community had that meeting and gave themselves the opportunity to have that voice, and then it was heard. It was put on the record. The way I was raised, I want to hear about how you were raised. I want to talk about how I was raised. I'll tell mine first, just very shortly. I was raised in Portland, Oregon, and it had a very low population of African Americans, and it has a native population, but they are all on. Most of them are on reservations. So I was raised in a very white community with a bunch of other white people. Having said that, where I lived, it was more privileged. So when there were people of different color, of different ethnicity that came in, they weren't really treated that much differently because we didn't really have this history of racism in my school or in my neighborhood or in my area. We even had, it was during the time of Pol Pot in the 70s, we even had Vietnamese kids come to the block, and they were brought over because they were being offered sanctuary from the genocide that was going on in Vietnam. In Cambodia. My apologies, Cambodia. Cambodia and Vietnam at the same time. There were terrible things going on. Regardless, the point is, we didn't really have enough people that were there to be racist against. So having this diverse anomaly didn't result in a lot of racism. In other parts of Portland, in the more impoverished parts, it was absolutely there. It was absolutely a problem, and and I think it remains a problem to this day, probably. But Oregon is a very liberal state with very liberal ideas and very inclusive ideas, and so I that's my contribution to the conversation is very limited because I did not experience true racism until I went back east and lived in New York, lived in Connecticut and worked in New York and started working in the Deep South. That's when I started experiencing it, and it was a culture shock like you would not believe. The way that even people who are European talk about each other and how they construct their lives in such a fashion as to denigrate, between Polish and Irish and Dominicans and Haitians and people from Mexico versus people from Cuba. I mean, it was just, I never understood that it was. I'm very. I don't know if you noticed this. I'm white, and my exposure was very limited. So that I didn't get introduced to that level of conversation about race and the anger over race until I went off to graduate school. Talk to me about your experiences, because I think people will be very interested to know your experience. Because you come from a border town, right? Originally.
Yeah, the border town is called Nogales, Mexico.
That's right.
Nogales, Sonora. I grew up in different parts of Mexico. Obviously, in Mexico, we have a very deep problem with racism in terms of people from natives.
Yes.
Because obviously we are a country that is the result of colonization.
Yes.
Years come here. So there's a lot of, the history of Mexico has a lot of racism in terms of, they call it class.
Yes.
But class is more about color of the skin.
That's right.
So, and about poverty. So there's a lot of classism in terms of people who doesn't have money or doesn't have the opportunities. There's a lot of racism in terms of ethnicity.
Right.
And a lot of sexism. So I grew up in this world. Obviously, I'm a man, so I don't suffer all these things. I just witnesses, and be a witness doesn't necessarily give you the capacity to understand. Because you want to believe that what I'm living is because I deserve it. If something good is happening to me, it's because I deserve it.
Right.
So if nothing's wrong is happening to me, it's because I deserve it.
Right.
In the reality, I live in a world that if something not wrong, if nothing wrong is happening to me, maybe it's because I'm a man, and I'm, I have the opportunity to speak a little bit of English because I see some SNL in my television.
Right.
So I have so many opportunities that I can now live, but it's very different if you live in this country, if you live this culture, and you come to this stage of life, you're an adult and starts thinking, maybe there's a big problem that I'm trying not to see because this problem actually gives me good things to me, and that's the most difficult part.
I really appreciate what you just said because it gave me better language to talk about my feelings, which is that as a witness, you are deluded into thinking because you see something, you understand it. And I have learned many times that just because I see a problem does not mean I understand the problem. If I have not experienced it directly, I can't possibly know. Especially, like, for example, there was a great SNL skit, and it was called Welcome to Hell. It was about, remember that? That was so well sketch. It should be, it's funny because it's absolutely true. Women live in a completely different world than men do in terms of how they perceive the world, the opportunities they get, and the dangers that they're in from men and other women. It's absolutely true. And unless you're a woman, you can't appreciate what they have to put up with. I've learned this obviously working over at the Nugget a little bit, watching the girls and watching. We have a very well behaved male community in our town, but I know that we talk about the horror stories the girls have of coming and working as servers in other places. It is horrifying what they have to put up with, and and even in a regular day, how women have to change their behavior in order to not offend men enough that they would get pissed off at them and might get hurt, but to say no to them when they don't want to receive their advances. It's a really interesting reality. So that, to me, I am merely a witness to that. I don't participate in it, and it makes it difficult for me to have an informed conversation other than to acknowledge that it's there. So that's, to me, I don't think most men have the capacity to understand exactly how bad it is, and it transcends not just the issue of dating. It goes into even more basic things like, do you know what it's like to menstruate? Do you know what it's like to be pregnant and have children? These are things that men think they understand, but they don't. They just don't. I mean, you just had you and your wife. You just had a child a year ago. Belam's birthday's coming up, and yes, you watched Giselle grow as she got larger and she became more pregnant, and the due date came upon you. But that doesn't mean that you understand what was going on in her head, right?
Right. In a lot of things. I mean,
yeah.
But the idea is that we live in a world that's built to not allow that type of knowledge or sensibility.
I like
we live in this world that is made for this sensibility and this knowledge and this language. That's the problem, you know. Obviously, we need to understand. But the most important part is that the people who are, who live in this world, who are not allowed to be heard, needs to be in this stage, needs to be in front. And I think that's we are going to try to work out the next years, you and me. Our voices can be heard in some places when we go and travel. So I think it's interesting to start including in our conversations, people from where we going, so they can speak and we can have a talk and we can learn from them. How about that?
I totally agree. I don't think I've ever regretted handing someone else the microphone and listening to their perspective, even if I don't agree with it. It's not even about agree or disagree, is it? It's about they're living their life and this is what they're experiencing. The problem that we run into everywhere we go, no matter what happens, is that you're going to have people who are capable of having an honest conversation about this kind of stuff, and people who are not able to have an honest conversation about it, who have a particular, I don't want to say agenda, that's not the right word, but they have a particular, they are willing to say, they're willing to exaggerate, they're willing to say things that aren't true. But the reality is, you can't exaggerate the gender inequities that exist. You can't exaggerate the class inequities that exist, and you can't exaggerate the harm that's done to our society and our justice system and all that. What can happen is individuals can fabricate things in order to make themselves feel like they're more a part of something than they really are, and that's when you and I get involved if there's a criminal element to it. I did we both published our textbook, False Allegations. We worked on it with Detective John Savino of the NYPD. We published it last year, and it's an important textbook with investigative and forensic implications. It's not a book about social issues per se. It talks about the consequences of some social interactions, but it's not really about social issues. It's not a sociology textbook. It's about how to investigate these kinds of crimes. So it is useful in the criminal realm. Now, I did an interview with Michelle Malkin, who's a TV personality, formerly of Fox News. Now she's doing her own stuff, her own branding. And in person, she's a very reasonable person. She's a very intelligent person. But her television personality is extremely far right. She's a female. She's of Asian descent, and she's very smart. And so she has a particular viewpoint that has to be heard. But really what she winds up doing is mimicking a far right-wing perspective that is, I personally find it unfair and distasteful politically. But I was on her show as a guest in terms of the false allegations in a particular case, and that's all very good. But then the textbook got used in a way to have a discussion about the Me Too movement that I think was completely unfair, completely unfortunate. It was an unfortunate use. It's her show, it's her stuff. Anybody can take what we've done and use it however they want. I would have preferred she would not have used our textbook as a basis for that. But our book got a lot of attention because of the fact that it talks about false allegations, and she was applying it to the social context as opposed to the criminal one. And of course, because what she was saying is basically all statements from women about these kinds of things have to be viewed with a grain of salt. And I would say that you don't put it that way. You put it this way: all criminal allegations have to be investigated the same way.
Exactly.
All, whether you don't go in with the idea whether they're true or false. All criminal allegations have to be investigated exactly the same way. All forensic examinations have to be done scientifically, and all the protocols have to be followed. If they're true, you'll find it out and you'll support it. If it's false, you'll find that out too. And that's the way it should be, so that there's objectivity and fairness in the process. I think it's a mistake to start applying that to every single person who's making a statement. Who's talking about their experiences with racism, with gender discrimination, or with sexual harassment, right? Until they start talking about a sexual assault and there's a criminal charge involved, it's a social issue that has to be discussed. It has to be dealt with. There's a greater social issue. Tell me what you were thinking about it, because I know I didn't quite address the things you're concerned about, but I'm just giving you my perspective. Let me hear your perspective.
Well, I'm totally agree with you. I think there's two different conversations.
Yeah.
Obviously, they have areas when they connect, when police or investigators don't understand. And I think we do the point earlier, saying like, if you don't understand the sexual harassment problem, if you don't understand how people live their lives, and you're doing criminal investigation, you're going to have with you all these stereotypes and ideas about how sexuality works and how everything works. So that's the sociological problem into the criminal investigation.
Exactly. Right. So the problem is the way we view each other as a culture, as a society, as males, females, Mexicans, Americans, that's informed by the media. And that's informed by our social constructs and basically our stereotypes, our cultural stereotypes, especially when we don't have the diversity in place to inform us otherwise, right? I mean, that's what it comes down to. So if we lack diversity, we're going to rely upon stereotypes. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, it's easier to rely on stereotypes, and because it's easier because the world still is the same.
That's right.
As you say the same, tomorrow is going to be the same,
right?
But it's not. Everything is changing right now.
No, exactly. So, if you don't see a responsibility to educate yourself, to filter what you're seeing, and to experience diversity, you're going to misunderstand everything that you're seeing, every perspective that you're seeing, every behavior that you're seeing. You're going to see it through the lens and the filter of your stereotypes, of your ignorance, of your narrow bandwidth of perspective. And that's, I can't tell you how much I appreciate, like I said, I've said this before, I'll say it again. It cannot be measured in value, the amount of information and experiences that I've gotten working with all the colleagues that I have in Mexico and all the colleagues I have throughout Latin America who have exposed me to things that I would never even imagine prior to those experiences. The diversity that I've seen it has caused me to reflect in a way that I wouldn't otherwise. And that's why I keep doing it, because don't get me wrong, I like to come down and I like to talk and I like to eat good food, because you guys have really good food, by the way. Really good food. You have really good food. I don't want to talk about tortas right now. Let's not talk about it. Let's not talk about chicharrón de ribeye. Let's not talk about it. But let's just say this. The experiences I've had, I wouldn't exchange it for anything else. And they've hopefully, I hope, made me better at what I do, because we don't live in one country anymore. We live in a place where people from different countries are constantly, they're going across borders. We have Americans in Mexico and you have Mexicans in America. in the United States of America, and Guatemalans and Ecuadorians and each one of them, and Haitians, and they all have their own culture and their own background and their own belief systems and their own way of behaving. And if you don't educate yourself about the range of possibility, you're going to miss out. You're going to misunderstand and you're going to misinterpret. That's what I've experienced.
That's very, and I think that needs to encourage everyone to.
Exactly right, and it speaks right to profiling because, and what we do in criminal and forensic investigations, because what we are interested in is understanding what it is we're seeing and not applying stereotypes or labels that would mislead us. The problem is criminal profiling, the way it's treated by many criminologists and the way it's treated by many investigators is as a means to, how do I say this, reify or to reinforce their stereotypes. And that's a problem. We should not be doing that. We have to transcend that. We have to give ourselves many sources of information. Instead, what I see is people reaching to criminal profiling and using it as a bludgeon to prevent themselves from understanding things further. It's like criminology. Like, it hasn't advanced that much in 50 or 60 years. And criminal profiling hasn't gotten much better either, other than some of the stuff that we've done over the years through the IAFC and the ABP. It hasn't really developed or evolved because the narrative that's been created has been created by very religious, very white people who have a very specific narrative that they want reinforced, a very specific view of the world and criminals that they want reinforced. They don't want it to be. They wouldn't understand if it were more diverse, and the more diverse it gets, the further away it gets from things that they care about. All right.
Yes. Yeah. So I think we're trying to, what we're trying to say, I don't know if you agree with me.
Let's hear it.
Is that it's a very complicated issue, but there's a lot of things where we have clear.
Yes.
We have facts. Sexual harassment exists.
Gender discrimination.
It's a real thing.
Yep.
And that we need to start doing better job to doing actual investigation when the justice system involved.
Well, we'll talk about sexual assault and false allegations on the issue of perspective and the issue of stereotypes. When we allow our personal feelings to get in the way, we filter the evidence. A couple of, like, 3 examples that come immediately to mind. There's a case in Australia, there's a case in the United States, and there's recently a case in the UK. All have involved false allegations made against males who, at the cusp of trial or during trial or right before trial, the cases had to be dumped because, there you go, the cases had to be dumped because it was determined that law enforcement had either not looked at the text messages between the 2 individuals and just believed the statements that were being made, or they had actively suppressed that information because it didn't fit the narrative that they want. And I think that's the problem that we have, is the human tendency to see the world as we want it, not as it is, and then to actively suppress evidence that is contrary to our beliefs or our needs. Talk to me a little bit about that before we sign off.
Well, obviously it's about personal beliefs, and I'm totally agree with that. But I think sometimes it's about political agendas.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes there's this one case. Let me give you an example.
Yes.
If you start talking about sexual harassment and Me Too movement, I bet you, like, in the next, weeks or 2 weeks, we're gonna hear about this false allegations case that is gonna be actual false allegation, and the media is gonna try to say that this is an epidemic problem.
Right.
I know what you mean. It's like, obviously, how the people in the criminal investigation field do their jobs is also because the people, the superiors,
Right.
want something. You know, they want to highlight something so they can be more like fearful, like saying like, I'm a tough guy with bad guys, and then like saying, oh, women are lying or whatever.
Right.
So I think it's personal beliefs. Yes, it is. But sometimes, not in a lot of cases, there's a political aspect of that, and that's the most threatening problem, because you cannot change that with only with instruction or with education, because people are not gonna be educated to not do what their superiors are asking for.
Worse than that, let me make it even more basic. I think you're absolutely right. But let's talk about what the motivation behind that is. The motivation in my mind behind that is to give them an excuse so they don't have to do anything.
Yes.
What they want is not to have to do their job. What they want is to not have to be held accountable or responsible. So what they'll do is find any way they can, anything they can, to confuse or to distort the issue so that they don't have to act.
Yes.
And that's it. That's the problem that I see. Instead, and where you and I stand is more like, well, as we learn more and as we become more experienced and more exposed to each other's ideas and the ideas that exist in the world and the different kinds of inequities that exist and the consequences of that socially and in the justice system, we want more. We want more information. We want more. We want a better sense of what's going on. We want more diversity because we recognize what we don't understand. We recognize what we don't know and our own limits because we want accountability. Whereas others don't want accountability at all. They want to not have to do anything. They want to not have to act. And they want it to stay the same because, as you said before, they're benefiting from what exists right now. Anybody who works for the government, who is currently getting paid by the government, has a government pension, or who has an identity associated with government service, they are getting the benefit of the system that exists. So they're not going to be interested necessarily in changing that system too much or too radically. And that's the problem that I see. What we need are people. What we need is this impossible unicorn type creature, which I've encountered a couple times. People who work in the government who want to see it change and are working inside of it to change. I don't, because really what it comes down to is people and their attitudes. If you have the right people in the right position, they'll be able to act in a way that's just and without malice towards their fellow men. Whereas I see that as being, right now I see more people trying to find ways to get out of having to do their job than anything else. Talk to me a little bit about that, because that to me is a big issue. I see that a lot.
And I think that leads to that where the change is going to come from.
Right. That's the question. Where is it going to come from?
The change is not going to come from the top. It's going to come from the people who are actually the victims, who are suffering this, who are doing the real job, and trying to change our environment so they can,
right,
do a better job. What I'm trying to say is that if we copy the model of the system in terms of how they do their training, how they try to sell their the information that trying to give you,
right,
is part of the problem.
Right.
And what we're trying to do is to reflect on this and trying to think beyond of what we're saying. Okay, we're not going to do all the change because the problem is a systematic problem.
Right.
But we can change a little bit the culture of the forensic community.
Right.
That's our field, and we can do a little bit about that. And how we can do that, including in our things, human rights,
yes,
gender problems, and trying to infuse from other social science what the forensic science have been doing from the last 50 years. So I think that's going to be the difference in the next 10 or 15 years.
Well, what's interesting to me, I'm going to tell you a really interesting story. I did my PhD, my thesis in my PhD in criminology. My thesis was on forensic fraud. And I did it at Bond University, very progressive, very open-minded. They had a great program there, and they were very supportive. Here's the interesting part. I was able to talk about cultural issues that create the environment where forensic fraud becomes more not only probable, but likely. Okay? And that was just a really good research, and I was able to publish it, and very helpful, very useful even to this day. And it has opened the door for me to include discussions about culture in other aspects of criminal investigation, because it caused me to do that kind of research and that kind of background. Now, here's the fun part. One of the original variables I was going to look at was gender. And I got told explicitly that I had to take that out because there was no room for any discussion about gender and forensic science or forensic fraud, or even criminality in general.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, and it was the female, one of the female advisors who said that to me on this when I was defending my PhD. She's like, "Well, that's a very slippery slope. I would take that out. You probably need to take that out." And they wouldn't let me move on unless I took that variable out. I was not allowed to study that issue. And I thought to myself, what are they concerned about revealing if we by suppressing that information? Because I think we ought to have any conversation we have to have, if it doesn't include the issue of gender and gender discrimination, it's difficult. It's less informed. Because like for example, rape investigation, we have to talk about gender perspectives, right? I mean, we had to. You made me do it. I mean, it was absolutely a necessary part of the textbook on false allegations. But when it comes to different kinds of criminal behavior, who's associated with what and what the social causes of that might be, why are people so afraid of addressing the issue? Tell me what your perspective on that is, because I think it's useful, and I think it will lead to insights that we don't have right now.
Well, I think I don't know the particular case, but I think to understand and to do gender studies, there's a whole different logic to trying to read the data. So I think in social science, there's a lot of fighting about gender studies,
right?
About how they can get used. But I think it's unfair how they be pictured by the media. I mean by the community to saying like gender studies are whatever. So I think it's a difficult thing in academia because I don't think they can be synthesized in one. We see it and we say like, okay, let's not study this, let's study that. I think it's different than that. And they are not going to be, the feminist studies and gender studies are going to have arguments between them. And we cannot understand them because we are not in the field.
Right.
And I think that's one of the parts of the academia where it's very curious because people don't read about gender studies, they don't read about feminism, but they give their opinion about it. And that doesn't happen in a lot of other areas of scientific study. You keep apart saying, no, I don't know about that. And I think that's why gender studies are different from other.
Well, it's almost like criminology because everybody who watches TV thinks they're an expert in criminology, right?
Yes.
That's a huge problem. But it's the same thing. Feminism and gender studies. I think everyone, because they watch because it's a topic that's covered, people think they understand it and they don't.
Yes, of course.
So anyway, I think because we have our own way of doing things, and we don't have we run our own institute. You and I, we run this institute together. You, me, Dr. Crowder, Dr. McGrath, we run this institute together, and therefore we have the ability to have these discussions that they can't have at universities without a massive backlash. And I don't mean giving our opinions, but including the subject as part of the conversation. And I don't have a political view on that other than to say that it should be part of the conversation. So we need that perspective.
Well, I think when the time goes by, when these things are getting more, I think we need to have a political view about this in the future.
How do you mean?
I don't know if we can have it right now. I mean, political view is about how we understand what's good for the public opinion. I mean, I know that we relate a lot the word political in terms of partisan or whatever. But I think the political aspect is very important, like saying, okay, I have this political view. This political view is about gender equality, and gender equality doesn't exist. The people who are doing their job are not. Actually, you have a lot of political views.
Yeah.
Because you talk about the system, and you talk about how these people are not doing their jobs because there's this systematic problem, whatever. That's a political view. And I think we need to put our political view in the public space. So we can talk about them because we cannot actually have a non-political view. We live in a political world.
And Bill, let's define for me what you think political means so that we can have this conversation intelligently.
Well, political it's about what's the common what's the word in English? El bien común, the commonwealth, the things.
Yeah.
Well, there's things that only to you matter because it's personal things.
Right.
But there's things that matter to all of us because it's part of the community. That's the political aspect of the world.
So for us, for me, the as you define it, it almost sounds more like the social aspect, because you have the individual and society, and that's the social aspect. The political aspect here in the United States, when we use that word, we tend to mean as it relates to the functionaries, as it relates to government, as it relates to political parties, as it relates to, that tends to be. But there's also an interpersonal way where you have the politics of interpersonal relationships and what that means for relationships between yourself and your family and your community and your job and all the power. What it has, politics tends to refer to power structure, and the perspective you're bringing to this conversation is that this is the problem with being an American, right? We have this fantasy that everybody's equal, so that we don't have to have a political conversation about equality. And since you live in Mexico,
too.
I know, right?
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Politics is for politicians.
Yeah.
That's what they want, of course.
Yes, but really, it's about power structure.
They want to tell us that this is they are different type of people. They're for no.
Yeah.
This is now the world is changing.
Right.
The people from the streets are talking in political terms.
That's right.
That's the scary part for them.
That's right. So we need to start thinking of politics as power structure, right?
Exactly.
The power structure, the power dynamic that exists between individuals, organizations, entities, communities, any power structure, or your employer. That's all politics. And so in terms of it being politics being a discussion about the power structure, that I think is the most valuable thing to come out of this conversation, because that gives us something to aim at. So whenever we're talking about decision making, whenever we're talking about resources, or talking about the ability, not just the knowledge about how to do your job, but the ability, the authority, and the backup, the support to do your job, that's politics, right?
Yes, it is.
All right.
And we need to talk. So the idea is we need to start to talk about politics in forensic science. Actually, we're talking a lot.
We're doing it right now. We've been doing it for the last hour. My book on forensic fraud is all about politics.
It's about politics.
It really is. It's about because if you just read it, instead of talking about police corruption, we should just talk about politics and law enforcement.
Exactly.
Or the politics of law enforcement. If we reframe the discussion that way, it's much easier, because corruption is this label that carries with it blame, and everybody hates it. It's why sociologists can't get anywhere near law enforcement, because law enforcement gets very upset, because it's immediately they're on the defensive. But if you're talking about power structure, everybody's under somebody's boot, and they understand that just fine, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I love this. This is so good. You're way smarter than you look.
Well, I have people telling me what to say right now.
Oh, jeez.
People smarter.
Is it all right? This just like Steve Bannon, because when he's under oath, he doesn't know how to answer questions unless he gets the phone call from the president's office telling him what he can say and what he can't say.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, that's so good. It's so good that we're doing this now in the terms of our new project on criminal psychology that we're seeking to be complete in the next few months. That's very good. Very good.
Yes, we're working on that. Yes.
I'm going to be thinking about that all day now. Now, that's all. I can't think of anything else. Politics and forensic science. Because really, what that's about is who gets to be a forensic scientist, who gets to testify in court. The judge has control over all the political... we're talking on Facebook yesterday about a case where the judge is going to allow the forensic examiner's background to be discussed in open court because the background is one of fraud and negligence. And normally they don't allow them to talk about that because it takes away the ability of them to present this face that they're perfect. And
Yes.
if you work privately like you and I do, we're constantly having to defend our backgrounds and our credibility in court with absolutely no support and absolutely no power base. The courtroom is all controlled by the judge. When you go in there, the political structure is very clear. You know what I mean? Does that make sense or no?
Yes.
So that's so interesting.
That's a very big difference.
I love that. The politics of the courtroom versus the politics of the field. It's very good. Very good. And then presenting, and then how you present yourself in that political arena will dictate whether or not people perceive that you have power because of your proximity to something. Your proximity
Yes.
to the crime scene or the dead body, or your proximity to the victim as somehow being the thing that gives you power or authority when it's not. It has nothing to do with it. That's so interesting. Okay. Well, now you've given me a bunch of new stuff to think about. And, well,
Yeah.
the same old stuff, but in a different way, which I appreciate.
Yeah, we both have, man.
I know, that's great. Well, my friend, what do you got on the schedule for the rest of the day?
Well, I'm going to eat with my mother.
Ooh.
She's actually outside my house. I need to go for them.
Okay. How is she doing? How's your mom?
She's really good, man.
Okay.
She's helping me a lot in some things about the university we're running, and
Great.
she's very good.
Hey, by the way, before I let you go, thanks for all the hard work you did this week negotiating our partnership with Ciuno. They're good people over there, and you're a good person too. So putting that group together is, I don't know if I could do it the way you did it. I mean, you're very clever.
The way we're going to announce that to the people,
That's
we're
right.
going to do a diplomat in forensic psychology and a criminal profiling in Hermosillo, Sonora.
That's
It's going
right.
to start in April. So let's we're going to have information of that pretty soon.
Okay. Again, I wanted to say on a personal, thank you so much for being my advocate on that, because I can't do it myself. You're the person on the ground. You're right there, and you're able to do it more effectively than me. And you're always so good at it. You have so much more patience than I do. I know you think you don't, but I know I know that you think you don't, but you do.
Well, I appreciate your trust, man.
No, you have it. You have it. All right, my friend, go say hi to your mom. Is your sister going to be there?
Yeah.
Say hi to your sister for me. Tell her I miss her. Tell Luna and tell
She
Luna
knows.
too. She knows?
She knows.
She knows. Oh, she's been getting my